Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh My JavaScript. Today, we'll be putting one of my favorite Angular testing libraries to test and see how much does it help to make the life of us, the developers, much more easier by doing the heavy lifting of setting up the test environment, providing various test utilities, as well as excellent documentation that makes unit testing with Angular more cleaner, simpler, easier, and above all, painless as well as enjoyable. Introducing a library called ngmocks, which is everything that I just described. Huge shout out to the author Michael Gusev and the team behind for this awesome library, and thank all of you for offering your support when I had reached with queries, and also being so kind to review the project code and even providing separate ideas to make the project even better. To anyone who watched this tutorial and felt that this had helped you in some way, do give the library a GitHub star for the efforts the author and his team had taken in bringing these for free. That's a lot of work, to be honest. I will leave the links for the library as well as the GitHub repository in the description. Let me set the expectations up front. This tutorial is not a testing 101. This is about exploring the library and putting it to a test ride. It's about showing you the features that this library is capable of and how it reduces testing efforts and increases developer productivity. So I assume that you have a minimum experience in testing, or at least familiar with terms like testbed, fixture, test suite, debug element, etc. Though I will try to explain each line of code as we go through. Today, we test a small untested application, and making use of this library, we complete unit testing for the whole application and bring the coverage up to 100%, and in between explain the library and the helpful utilities which can save considerable time when our aim is to write quality unit test when working under a tight schedule. It's not just about getting that green check mark to sneak in through that automated build process that fails if we haven't met certain percentage of coverage. It's also not about writing dummy tests just to get around code reviews. While those might be short-term workarounds, we grow as a developer when we actually start facing these things and address them without fear. It's about putting ourselves out of the comfort zone in pursuit of getting ourselves better. Having 100% test coverage is tough. Writing proper unit tests to get that coverage is hard. Writing sensible tests that actually matter is the hardest. Those who can code and test their own code is what every company is after. That's it as far as the introduction is concerned. There is a lot to be taught and a lot to be learned. We don't have time to waste. Let's jump straight into the content. Please navigate to the GitHub repo github.com/ohmyjavascript/ng-mocks-testing, which is where the whole project lies. And here we have two branches, the finished branch which contains all the finished code, as well as the starting branch which is devoid of any testing code. So please clone the starting branch into your local machine and open it up in your favorite IDE. Do an npm install and do ng-serve so that we can see how the application looks like. Or if you want to see a preview, just go to the start branch, come down, there is a live demo here. If you open that in a new link, this would be the application. So this is a very small application as far as the functionality is concerned, but good enough to explore almost all the concepts that ngmocks offer. On load, we are loading a bunch of products. We do have the shopping cart, the contact us features, and we have a shopping cart which tracks the count of the items which is added to the shopping cart. Also, we have a hover feature using directives. We can go to the product detail page. We can add an item to the cart and the item number increases. The shopping cart number increases here. And if you go to the shopping cart, we see that the items are added to the shopping cart as well. And the main attraction would be if you navigate back to the GitHub repository and come down a bit, the test coverage portion where every single piece that includes components, pipes, services, directives, everything is tested, and the statements, branches, functions, and lines, everything is 100%. Together, we write around 35 test cases that covers various scenarios, which is a lot of test cases to understand this library. On the terminal, let's do git clone and the URL to the repository. Let it be cloned, and once that's done, let me do cd into the library and do npm install. At the time of this recording, my node version is 16.18.1 and the Angular version that I am running on is version 13.3.3. I have opened up the application in Visual Studio Code and I have made sure that the branch is set to start and did the npm install so that we have the node modules. Going through the package.json, apart from the Angular based packages, there are only two extra packages. One is Jest and the other is Just Marbles. I am not using Jasmine, which is the default testing package that come along with Angular, but I have switched that to Jest so that writing test cases becomes a bit more easier. Just Marbles is just to cover a couple of observable test cases, which I will explain as we go through it. Within the src folder, if you take a look, as of now, there is not even one single spec file. So if you switch back to the terminal and do an ng test, it should say it cannot even find one single spec file. So this is the ideal starting point. Before proceeding, just to clarify what we do here, this is not TDD or test-driven development. But once you are comfortable with the process, you can work backwards, set the test first, and write the code against the test to make sure that you get a fail first, and then write the least amount of code to get a pass for that. Personally, I have been in projects where the only task I had been doing for one single sprint was to complete unit testing for the application that was written by a dozen of other developers. So that's the same pattern we use here, where we already have a finished application done with Angular material. So if we check the application, we do have a fair bit of Angular material components used. So this will stand close to a real project as far as possible. Just as a small refresher, an Angular application is not a standalone single piece, but a collection of smaller pieces like services, components, directives, pipes, modules, all working together to create an application. So when it comes to unit testing is also about testing pieces in isolation, assuming that the other parts will work as expected. So for everything that I have mentioned here, that's services, components, directives, pipes, and modules, if you go to the ng mocks documentation, we do have separate pieces for all of these things. For mocking services, components, directives, pipes, and modules, we do have separate utilities. We will be covering most of those in this tutorial as well. Let's go ahead and install the ngmocks package. So in the terminal, let's do npm install ng-mocks --save-dev. So once the package is installed, let's head back to the application. Let's go to setup-jest.js and introduce the ngmocks. So here I'm saying import something from ngmocks, and that something is ngmocks itself. So once this is imported, let's do ngmocks.autospy, and we can define which sort of spy you need to. Is it a Jasmine spy or a Jest spy? Since I'm using Jest in this application, I will go ahead and put Jest as the auto spy. Let's start writing our first test case, for which let's open the app.component.ts to see if there is something worth testing. The only thing that's left here is title. And as far as the app.component.html is concerned, this is just a template that contains 1 2 and 3 special items. The app navbar and app footer are custom components, whereas router outlet is a directive. So let's add app dot component dot spec dot ts, within which let's write our first test. Let's see how we would have written this the traditional way without ng mocks. So let's have our imports first. So our custom elements schema, our component fixture, the test bed, as well as the component to be tested, which is also called SUT or subject under test. Let's have our describe block, within which let's bring in the component. Let's assign that to a variable called component. Let's have a fixture, and that fixture will be holding the app component. So what exactly is a fixture? A fixture is something that helps us debugging or testing the component. So once we have the fixture, that gives access to a component's template as well as component's logic file or the class file. So this is the entry door. So once you cross that door, you can go left or right. If you go left, you will get the component's template. If you go right, you get the component's logic file or the class file. That's fixture in a nutshell. So let's have our before each, within which let's bring in the testbed.configure testing module declarations that we use to see often. Let's register the app component in the declarations, and let's have our before each once again, within which let's define the fixture. So we call testbed.create component of the app component so that we create a fixture. From the fixture, we get the component instance by calling fixture.component instance, and then we call fixture.detect changes so that it runs the change detection once. Now let's have our it clauses, our test cases. So we are saying it should create, and then we say expect component to be truthy. So this is the basic starting point for any component testing. Why do we have custom elements schema? Without the custom elements schema, the moment Angular compiler detects a custom component which is not a normal HTML component, the test fails. Now, if we use custom elements schema, it says, okay, if you are encountering any custom components or attributes, just leave it. We know how to test that. Don't raise an error just because of that, or don't fail the test case just because of that. There is one more schema called no errors schema, but that is kind of pushing every errors under the sink. Sometimes we want the template to raise the error, notifying us that something has failed. But if you use no errors schema, every single error is suppressed. So that defeats the purpose of testing. Now let's go ahead and run ng test. It runs the app.component.spec file, and we have a passing test. Now instead of using custom elements schema, which in a way is still cheating around by saying just ignore things which it doesn't understand. So instead of doing that, let's make use of ng mocks to mock the components which we need. So which are the components? If we go to the app.component.html, we need to mock the app navbar, app footer, as well as the router outlet directive. So in the app component.spec.ts, let's remove the schemas, and within the app component, let's do mock component of navbar component, mock component of footer component, and mock directive of router outlet. So the mock component as well as the mock directive is being imported from the ng mocks. Now we have specifically mocked the components we need. We are not hiding that behind a custom error schema. We save the test, we go back to the terminal, and let's do ng test once more. This should hopefully pass again, which it does. Now there is a better way of writing this. although we are making use of mock component and mock directive from the ngmocks package, still we are depending upon the testbed.configure test module to set up the test. With ngmocks, they provide a much easier syntax, which is much less verbose than the traditional one which we are using right now. Let's see how that is, for which let me delete everything once again. Let's have the imports first, for which let's import mock builder as well as mock renderer from ngmocks. Let's import the SUT or the subject under test, which is the app component. Let's import the app module within which the app component is registered. Now the imports are done. Let's have our describe, within which let's do the before each. So till this point there is nothing new, but here is where the twist comes. There is no more testbed.configure.testing module. Instead, that's been kind of abstracted behind the scenes using mock builder. To the mock builder, I'm passing the component that needs to be tested, or the SUT, which is the app component, and I'm saying mock everything else. Just as a catch-all, I'm saying app module. So only this would be the real subject under test, and everything else in the app module is kind of mocked for us. Rather than individually specifying mock component of footer, mock component of header, mock directive of the router outlet. So instead of specifying them individually, since everything is registered within the app.module.ts, I'm passing that as a one single dependency to the mock builder as the second parameter. So this will mock everything else except app component. Now, once that is done, let's do our test cases, within which I'm saying it should create the component and let's say const fixture equal to mock render of app component. So mock render is something that can help us create component within the test environment, and we can grab the template as well as the class file from the fixture. Instead of writing lengthy test cases that we used to do before, this is just a one-line shortcut which does everything for us behind the scenes. In line 11, on the fixture property, we have our mock render of app component. So if you hover the mock render, we see the explanation. It says that this signature of mock render without params should not autocomplete any keys or any types. That is basically because we are not passing any parameters to the mock render. Parameters is something like our at input, at output, etc. for the component, which we will see a bit later. Now, all we need to do is expect fixture.point.component instance. I said previously that fixture is a door towards our component instance or our components template. Now with ngmocks, we no longer call the fixture.component instance or fixture.debug element directly, but there is something called a proxy called point. That's how the documentation says. So we call fixture.point.component instance or fixture.point.debug element, and we expect that our component is defined. So if things go well, we switch back to the terminal, do ng test, and this should pass again. And thankfully it passed. So instead of the traditional way of writing the Angular test cases, we have replaced that with ngmocks. Now, if you ask me which approach was the better one, it's a no-brainer for me at this point, but hold on, it's just the tip of the iceberg. We explore a lot more features from ngmocks moving forward, but I surely hope that this would have certainly made you exciting to dig deep into this wonderful library. Let's go in the order of the folder structure here so that it becomes a bit more easier for us to track. So let's start with the components folder, within which let's start writing test cases for individual components within. Let's start with the navigation list. So here let's add a new file called navigation-list dot component dot spec dot ts, before which let's go and have a look at the components logic file as well as the template. So within the class file, we have our at input, and within the template, we have a simple template, but with a link that has got a mat button, a router link, as well as a mat icon with the count as well as the color. So when testing, we need to consider everything we have in the template as well. Let's see how that works. Let's have the imports for the files first. So the import of the navigation list component, which is the subject under test. Let's also import mock builder, mock render, as well as ngmocks from the ngmocks library. Let's also have the app module, which is something which we can pass as the second parameter towards the mock render. This is something which we have seen in the previous example as well. Let's have our describe block, which says let's have the navigation list components to be tested, within which let's have the before each that returns the mock builder. We pass the subject under test as the first parameter, which is the navigation list component, and let's pass in app module as the second parameter. This is something which we have already seen in the previous example. Let's start writing our test cases. Now let's say it should be defined. So navigation list component should be defined, for which let's have the fixture. So the fixture would be mock render of whatever component we have, which is the navigation list component. So once we have our fixture, we call fixture.point.component instance to be defined. So this is exactly the previous example. There is nothing new. It's more or less just a revision. So if I run this test case, will it pass or fail? So if I do ng test, this should pass. Now as a shortcut, if I only need to run one single file, I can do yarn just the name of the file, which is navigation-list.component. Now understand that I have yarn also installed in my PC. It's not just npm. So if I do yarn just whatever the name of the file, it will only go and pick that particular file and run the test cases for that single file. So our test case is passing as expected. Now let's go back to our spec file and write the second test case. So let's do, it should display the count, because navigation list has got a shopping cart with the count number. So let's test that it should display the count. The test case is usually a 3-step process wherein we arrange everything for the test, we act on top of it, and then we assert something. Let's have our arrangements first. So we have our fixture and we have our component. So we have access to both fixture and component. And now we have access to our mat icon. So if you go to the template, there is a mat icon component. This is a material UI component. It's not a HTML component, but this is a custom Angular component from material UI. And ngmocks provides us with helpful utilities to grab such items from the template of the DOM. So here I am saying I need access to the icon element so that I can check the count of the icon as well as the class here if we want. So here I am saying const icon element. You can name it whatever you want, but I'm saying ngmocks.reveal. So ngmocks.reveal allows finding debug nodes which belongs to an ng container or ng template starting from an element. So here I am saying I passed fixture as the parameter, and from the fixture I am asking to figure out the mat icon component. So the compiler goes through here. Since this is the template that I have passed, it goes through the template and finds something called mat-icon, which is what I have asked here. So we have an access to the component, the mat icon component. I can do component.count equal to 2. Now I have access to the component instance here, and if we take a look at the component instance, it has got an at input called count. So once I have access to the icon element, I can act on it by saying component.count equal to 2. Now I have set my at input. I already have my component. I already grabbed the mat icon from the template, and now I can expect that I did my fixture.detect changes, so that once I have set my at input, since this is the test environment, the change detection will not be triggered by default. So I explicitly trigger the change detection using fixture.detect changes. And let's do the assertions here. Now the arrange is complete. The act portion is complete. Now let's do the assert portion. Here I am saying expect ngmocks dot input of icon element of mat badge. So all I am saying here is the ngmocks dot input allows to get an input value without knowing which component or directive it belongs to. So all I am saying is don't worry about anything. Just go to the icon element and grab the mat badge property. So in the template, we have the mat icon element having the mat badge input property. So it went ahead and grabbed the mat badge from the icon element, and this contains what? This contains the count. So here I am saying that count should be component.count. So whatever I have set here should be whatever which is shown in the UI. So let's run the test case and see if it passes or not. Yarn just navigation list. So if I run this test, this passes. Now just to make sure that it passes the right value, so here I am saying instead of the component.count, I am explicitly assigning a value called 3. Now this should break saying I expected 2 but I got 3, which is what we got. So our assumption is right. So the test basically says the input which was provided was count 2. So in the UI, what I expected to see as the input for the mat icons mat badge property is 2, but what I am seeing is 3. So what we wrote is right. Our expectations are right. So we switch back to the component.count. Now that we saw it fail, let's see it pass once again. So I run the test case once more and the test case is passing. This is the right time to show you a bit of performance optimization. Now if we look at the documentation, it says mock render creates a special wrapper component which should be injected into the testbed. The wrapper is needed in order to render a custom template. So basically what that means is we have identical mock render calls in line 12 as well as line 18. And each time a mock render is getting called, it creates a special wrapper component behind the scenes before attaching them to the testbed. So for 2 tests, it creates 2 wrapper components. If there is 20 tests, we need to create 20 wrapper components. If there is 200 tests, it needs to sit and create 200 wrapper components behind the scenes, which will eventually slow down the test case. So ngmocks gives us a utility called ngmocks.faster, wherein we take our individual mock render calls out of the test, we remove the before each and we replace it with something. Let's see how that works. All we need is to use mocked component fixture. So here I am writing let fixture, which is of type mocked component fixture, which accepts our subject under test, which is our navigation list component. And then we call ngmocks.faster. Now instead of the before each, we replace that with a before all. So before all, let's have the mock builder, which accepts the subject under test along with the app module. And let's have one more before all and say fixture equal to mock render of the component. So we no longer have fixture defined within individual test, but it's defined before the before all. So before every single test runs, it already sets up the fixture. The wrapper component is already created once. It's not getting created again and again for individual test. We took the mock render out of individual test. We put it towards a common place inside the before all, before which I call the ngmocks.faster. So this will essentially make our test run a bit faster. Let's check that. Let's go back to the terminal. Let's do yarn just navigation list component, and this should pass as usual, which it tests. Moving on to the next component to test, which is the product component. So if we take a look at the product.component.ts, this is similar to what we have seen before because we have the @input component and we have already tested the @input in the previous example. But in addition to that, there is the @output, which is an event emitter and an event handler called add_to_cart. And if we notice the product.component.html, we have app highlight, which is a directive that is attached to the card to give it a hover functionality, a router link, a button with a click event, as well as the add_to_cart event handler for the same. So there is quite a bit of functionality that we are testing in this component. Let's go ahead and add a product.component.spec.ts. Let's have our imports first. So we import mock builder, mock component fixture, mock render, and ngmocks from the package ngmocks. We bring in the SUT, which is our product component. We bring in the app module. We bring in the model, which is product. And last but not the least, we bring in the mock product, which is just a mock for the product, so that we can supply a default value. Let's have our describe block for the product component, within which let's call the mocked component fixture. So mock component fixture take in the component, and if we need, we can also pass in the definition of input and output as the second parameter, which is what I'm doing right now. So I put a comma and I pass in product, which is the @input that is of type product. Similarly, I call ngmocks.faster like the previous example. I have my before all and I do mock builder of product component passing app module. So this step is exactly the same as we have seen before. We have our second before all, within which we set our fixture. So we called fixture equal to mock render of product component. Now this is the place if we need to supply default values to begin with. Since I have defined the product here, I can pass in a configuration object and use the product property and pass in a default value called mock product. So when the component renders, it renders with this one singular mock product as the @input. Let's have our test. It says it should be defined. So product component should be defined, within which we have our expectation, which says fixture.point.component instance to be defined. So if things go well, let's switch back to the terminal and let's do yarn just product.component.spec.ts, and the test passes. Now that the default test is over, let's write a test for the @input. So let's have our it block, which says it should test the input property within which let's have our component which we grab from the fixture.component instance. Since the fixture is outside, we can grab it anywhere within the describe block. So we grab a fixture.component instance and assign that to a variable called component. Let's have our expectations. Now we have already passed in the mock product as the at input for the product. So when the component renders, all we need to check is component dot product, which is the at input. That should be, so dot to be the mock product. If the expectations are right, the test case should pass, which it did. Now let's go ahead and write the third test case for the at output. Before writing the test case for the at output, let's have an understanding about what needs to be done. In the product.component.html, there is a button that is wired the click event handler of add to cart. So when the button is clicked, it triggers the add to cart method in the class file. And within the add to cart method, we have an event emitter. So when the button is clicked, we should expect that the event emitter should have been called. Since we already have the definition for the at input, we can also have the definition for at output. So I put a comma and say on add to cart is of type function. And since we have defined the at output definition here, we need to have the mock value here as well. So here I pass in a mock function to on add to cart. So just dot function creates a mock function. So I am assigning that mock function on to the on add to cart. Now let's have our test case. We say it should test the output property. Let's grab the component just like what we have did in the above test case. So we have our component. To trigger the click, we need to have a handle on the button. So we write button element equal to ngmocks.find of button. So what this does is that this will go to the template and find the button for us. So once we grab the button, we can use the ngmocks.click of button element to trigger the click functionality of the button. So we grab hold of the button here, we click the button here, and once we click the button, we expect that the at output should have been called. So we write expect component dot on add to cart to have been called. If the expectation is right, the test case should pass. And it passed. Moving on to the next component, which is the products component, which is one of the bigger components here. So let's take a look at the class file. This has an observable product property. This has a dependency injection of two services, which is the product service as well as the shopping cart service. On on init, it's supposed to bring in the product details, and we have an event handler called handle add to cart, which when clicked, this will add an item to the shopping cart. And in the template, we have the observable being stripped as the products property, and we iterate through the products property to display the individual product component. Let's add the spec file products dot component dot spec dot ts. Let's do the imports first. So I start with the mock product as well as the mock products. So these are the mocks which I have built here in the mocks file. Let's bring in the mat progress spinner, shopping cart service, product component, because product component is what which is getting iterated within the products component. Products component, which is the subject under test, mock builder, mock render, and ngmocks from the ngmocks package. Products service, because that is one of the dependencies being injected into the constructor. Of and empty from rxjs, because we are dealing with observables. I also have imported the code from the just marbles so that we can have our assumptions on observables a bit more cleaner. Rather than doing the dot subscribe pattern, it's a bit more easier to do the just marbles pattern. I imported the app module and let's have our describe block. Within the describe block, let's have our before each and let's do mock builder of products component passing everything. Now till this point, nothing changes. This is what we have done in the other cases also. But here we are going to do something slightly different. Because we do have two services as the dependency injection, we need to mock them separately. So I do dot mock of product service. So I am saying for the product service, I will mock manually the value that is supposed to return. So what should we do? Put a comma, an object, and within the object I'm saying get all products is supposed to be mocked. So whenever the product service dot get all products is called in the class file, replace that with this value. Instead of the real product service dot get all products, what is getting returned is this observable value of the mock products. Similarly, let's do the mock for shopping cart services. We put a comma, a configuration object, and we are calling shopping cart service dot add to cart within the method. So we need to mock this service dot add to cart. Since that service doesn't return anything, but this is a method, we say method returns empty. Let's have our it should render the component first test case, within which let's do fixture equal to mock render of our SUT, which is the products component, and we expect the fixture to be defined. If the wiring up is right, this should pass. So let's do yarn just products dot component and the initial test passes. Moving ahead with the next test case, it should have the products from service on init. So what's happening here? We have our ng on init, and on the on init, this should get the products service dot get all products, which is an observable of the product array, and that is getting unwrapped in the template. So here we are saying, since we have already mocked the response, the get all products will return off of the mock products. So the moment we subscribe to it in the ng on init, what we are supposed to get is this value. So let's go ahead and grab the fixture, and from the fixture, let's get the component using fixture dot component instance. Here I am setting the expectations using the Jasmine marbles. Here I say the expected observable equal to, it's a cold observable. So until and unless I subscribe it, this will not be triggered. And this value basically means on frame 1, I should emit A, and in the same frame that should be completed. That is why we have the opening and the closing braces along with the pipe symbol. So in frame 1, the value is emitted and completed. And what is the value that is getting emitted? That is the mock products. So I am expecting that I will get the mock products as the value. This is the expectation. So here I am saying expect component dot products. So the products is the observable product array, and I am saying expect component dot products observable to be an observable of our expected value. So this is an observable, and so I am saying this to be the observable of expected. We could also do it the subscribe way, where we could write component dot products dollar dot subscribe of data, and within the data we can have our expectations here, but rather than subscribing it like this, the to be observable is the cleaner way of writing it. So that's why we have the just marbles. So if the assumptions are right, the test should pass. So if you do yarn just products component, the second test case have also passed. So we have our value on init. Moving on to the next test case. Let's do it should trigger service method on handle add to cart. So once we click the handle add to cart, it should trigger the add to cart method on the shopping cart service. Let's grab the fixture from the mock render of products component, and from the fixture let's grab the component using fixture.component instance. Let's get the shopping cart service instance because we need to call add to cart on the shopping cart service. Let's get a service instance first. So ngmocks.find instance of whatever service we need. So this will give us the instance for the shopping cart service. And once we have the service instance, I can say just.spy on whichever service and whichever method we need to spy on. So on the shopping cart service instance, find the method called add to cart and spy on it. So whenever from within the component we call shopping cart service dot add to cart, this spy would be triggered instead of the real service method. So now that we have a spy, we can do the expectation. Now let's say expect spy to have been called. So this was the arrangement part. We have our arrangements. This was our act part where we acted on it by calling component.handle add to cart method manually, and this was our assertion part where once we click the button or once we trigger the handle add to cart method, the spy should have been called. So if the logic is right, let's switch back to the terminal and do yarn just products.component, and the third test should also pass. Moving to the next component, which is the shopping cart component. So this seems to be a very simple component. It has only an at input, which we have already done in the navigation list. So this is more like a revision for us. In the template also, there is nothing special. So let's add our shopping cart dot component dot spec dot ts file. Starting with the imports, let's start with the subject under test, which is a shopping cart component, followed by the mock builder and mock render from the ng mocks, followed by the mock cart, which is coming from our mock file. Let's have our describe block that specifies the shopping cart, within which let's have our first before each that returns mock builder of our subject under test. So this is our mock builder, which is the equivalent of our testbed.configure testing module. Let's have our first unit test. It should be defined. So shopping cart should be defined. Let's create our fixture using mock render. So I used mock render and passed in the subject under test, which is a shopping cart component. And to the mock render, I can also pass in the configuration object within which we can customize the at input. So we can configure the at input. Since the shopping cart has got an at input of item, we can also pass in an object whose property is item and the value which we want to mock is coming from the mock cart. Now that the fixture is set, we can say expect fixture dot point dot component instance, which gives access to the class, and from the class we have access to the item, and that value should be equal to the mock cart. So this test is relatively simple and straightforward. So let's get back to the terminal and do yarn just shopping hyphen cart dot component, and the test should pass. The next in line for testing is the directives. So what we have is a highlight directive. So all it does is it gets attached to a card, and once we hover on it, it attaches a class called box shadow, And once we hover out, this class is taken out of the respective component. So we are going to test the functionality of the directive independently. Highlight dot directive dot spec dot ts. As usual, let's start with the imports. I have kept the actual directive side by side so that as and when we are writing the logic, I can explain a bit more. So starting with the imports, let's import the subject under test, which is the highlight directive. Let's import the mock builder, mock render and ngmocks from the ngmocks package. Let's import component from Angular core. And let's build a dummy component. So this component, as of now, this is just a class, and when we decorate a class with the @component, Angular is good enough to recognize that this is no longer a class, but it identifies this class as a custom component. So this custom component as of now has got only one div within which we attach our directive. Now when we are testing the directives, we need a component to which this directive needs to be attached so that when we hover this div, the functionality of the directive should work. For that, we need a host, and what we are having here is a host component, or we can call it a test component, whatever name doesn't matter. Let's have our describe block for the highlight directive, have our before each, and say mock builder, and we need the test component. We have created a test component here, so this need not be mocked. So we need the actual test component as well as the actual highlight directive. So I say keep highlight directive. Have our first it close. So our first test, I said highlight directive should render. We grabbed our fixture from mock render of test component. So this is our test component. We grabbed the fixture. So we have access to the components template as well as the components class. We said highlight directive equal to ngmocks.get of ngmocks.find the div, and from the div grab the highlight directive. So we have the div here, and from the div we need to grab the app highlight directive. Then we will be able to test the functionality within the directive. So step 1 would be grabbing the directive, which is what we have here. So const highlight directive ngmocks.get and ngmocks.find. It will go find the div, and from the div it will figure out the highlight directive. The element under test is the div here. So ngmocks.find of div. Why do we need to grab this element? Because we need to hover this element for the directive to be triggered. So we grabbed the element on which we are attaching the directive. Now I say ngmocks.trigger of element, and the event is mouse over. So on this element, please do the mouse over. That is essentially having the mouse over on top of the card. So what happens when we mouse over? Actually, it needs to attach the class of the box shadow. And since this is the test environment, when we trigger something, we also need to call fixture.detect changes to trigger the change detection manually. And once that is done, we expect that the highlight directive .isHover is set to be true, which is what the logic here mentions. Whenever there is a mouse over, the directives isOver should be set to true. So moving back to the terminal, yarn just highlight the test passed because we had the hover here, and upon hover the isHover was set to true. Now what happens when we hover out? So we say ngmocks.trigger of element of mouse out. We had the mouse over and now we are hovering out. So what happens if we hover out? We hovered out and we triggered the change detection once more. And now if we expect, it should be highlight directive dot isHover to be falsy. So when we hovered, the isHover was set to true, and when we hovered out, the isHover is set to false. Running the test case, and it passed as well. Now that the functionality is working, we can go ahead and write one more class to make sure that box_shadow is the exact class name that is getting attached and detached for the functionality. Let's write one more test case which says it should find the extra class in the DOM on hover. Let's bring in the fixture and let's do ngmocks.find of div to grab the element. So we grabbed this div, which is the element, and we triggered the mouse over. We did the fixture.detect changes. So the mouse over is done. And now our expectation is that ngmocks.format.html of the fixture. So this fixture gives access to the template also. So format HTML of fixture, that will give the plain text of the actual template. So to see that, let's do console.log of fixture, or to be more easier, let's do console.log of ngmocks.format.html of fixture. So if we run the test case once again, let's see what is the output. This is the output that it had, and in the output we can see that there is a class called box_shadow. Our ngmocks.format.html of fixture definitely contains the box_shadow. So the expectation is right, and the test also passed. Moving ahead with the rest, there is nothing to test in the mocks file. So is the models. These are just models. And let's move into the pages. And the first component in line is the add-product. Let's take a look at the class file. So this has a form. This has a product service which is dependency injected. And on submit, this calls a product service. And once the submission is successful, the form is reset. Let's take a look at the template. Here also there is a form, an ng submit with the on submit handler, and a bunch of material UI fields. Let's add the spec file for it. Add -product.component.spec.ts. Let's bring in the imports first. So the mock form. From RxJS, we bring in the empty as well as the subject. We bring in the products service. We bring in the add product component, which is the subject under test. We bring in mock builder, mock render, and ngmocks from the ngmocks package. App module, forms module, and ng model from Angular forms, since we are dealing with a template driven form here. The mat input, because we are having input forms. We start our describe block for the add product component. Now here is when I show you a slightly different approach. This is just one of the many approaches. So depending upon the person who is writing, everyone will be having their own idea. This is my idea about testing this. So I have an add product to DB, which is a subject. I know that the product service dot add product to DB is an observable. So if I hover this, I know that this returns an observable. So I attach the add product DB to be a subject. Why? I'll come to it a bit later. We have our before each and the mock builder, which takes in the subject under test and the app module. We know that there is a product service whose add product to DB needs to be customized. So I said dot mock of product service, but I decide the add product DB and what it needs to return. So instead of having the real add product to DB, I mock it with my custom subject here. And I also call keep the forms module because I need all the template driven forms functionality. So I said keep the forms module. I also need the mat input. So I said don't mock it, just give me as is. In the before each, I said add product to DB equal to new subject. So for each individual test, it starts as a fresh subject. I said the add product component should be defined, and within the logic, let's grab the fixture first and expect that the fixture dot point dot component instance to be defined. Let's do add hyphen product. And if there is no surprises, the test should pass. Moving on to the next test where we expect certain things to be present in the template. Now this is moving away from the class testing more towards the DOM testing, which is a very subjective area. Some people doesn't prefer testing the DOM, rather they are happy and satisfied by testing the class because DOM consistently changes and tiny changes would definitely break the unit test. If you want that sort of control, you go ahead for testing the DOM, or else if you are happy with testing the logic, stay with the class testing. So let's start by writing the test case. I'm saying it should test the title control to be defined. So there is a title mat form field. So this control should be defined, for which let's do mock render of app product component. So this is our add product component, which is the subject under test. We have our mock render. So it creates a wrapper component behind the scenes and attach it to the test bed. We do title input element equal to ngmocks.find. So we are asking the ngmocks to go to the template and find something called title control, which is having the data test ID. So we have an attribute called data test ID who is having the value of title test control. So this test is asking go to the DOM and check if such an input exists there or not. So this we have grabbed our title input element, and with that let's do expect ngmocks.get title input element. So let's grab this one, and on this input element make sure that there is a mat input. Also let's do one more expectation. I say ngmocks.get of title input element, and on this input element there should be an ng model also. So 1, there should be a mat input, and 2, there should be an ng model. Both should be defined. So if we switch back to the terminal and run yarn just add product, the test case passes. Moving to the next test case, this should test the title control on change, which means once we start typing inside the input control, it should track the change. So let's write the test case for that. We grab the fixture. We grab the component from the fixture.point.component instance, and let's do ngmocks.find data-test ID and title control. So basically it says go to the template, figure out the input with the data test ID of title control. So it grabs this title control, ngmocks.change of title input element, and we pass in the new value. So this is equivalent to typing into the input control. So once the input control changes, we expect that the component dot add form dot value dot title is whatever we have typed here initially into the input. Jumping back to the terminal, if we run the test case, it passes. The next test case would be about testing the on submit functionality. So let's have the test which says it should test the on submit functionality. Let's bring in the fixture, and since we know that we need the product service so that we can call the add product to DB method on this service. Let's do ngmocks.find instance of the product service so that we are grabbing the product service instance to this property. And let's do const spy equal to just dots spy on the service and the method that we needs to spy on. So since we have access to the service, we can say spy on this particular method of this particular service. We grabbed the component instance and we did component dot on submit and passed in a mock form. So if you see here on submit, a form is being passed. So our mock form is having the exact same signature as that of the submitted form, which contains title, price, description, image and category. So once we manually trigger the component.onSubmit, that is equivalent to the form submission. So once the form is submitted, we do the change detection manually and then we can say expect spy to have been called. So summarizing, when the form is submitted, the onSubmit method would have been triggered and this triggers the this.productService.addProductToDB service call. So if the wiring is right, let's run the spec file and we should see that it should test the onSubmit functionality. There is one more functionality that needs to be tested here. So on the form submit, once the product service.addProductToDB is a success, the is added should be switched to true and the current form should be reset. So let's write the test case for that. It should reset the form and show the alert upon submit, because in the UI, once the form is submitted, for a brief moment, we will see the notification saying that the form submission was a success. So we grab the fixture and from the fixture we grab the component. Here we say just dots spy on and component dot add form of reset form, because here we need to spy on the reset method of the add form. So I said spy on component dot add form, its reset form method, and we called it form spy. Then we submitted the form, so component dot on submit and passed in the mock form. So the form submission has happened. Now when the form submission happened, we had one subject initially mentioned here and the subject was add product to DB. So here I am explicitly triggering this subject saying add product to DB dot next. So I triggered the subject manually. So once we call the add product to DB dot next, the subscription happens and whatever logic which we have here, this runs. So here I can expect component dot is added to be true and form spy to have been called, because we already had set a spy for the add form dot reset form. So if the logic is right, let's run the test case and it passes. Moving to the next component to be tested, which is the cart component. So in the TS file, there is nothing much except a dependency injection of shopping cart service, and in the ng on init, we pull the data from the shopping cart service dot get all cart items, which is an array of cart. This is not an observable, but an array of cart. And in the HTML, all we have is a header, and either we show that the cart is empty or we show the cart. So there is nothing huge here either. Let's add the spec file cart.component.spec.ts. Starting with the imports, let's bring in the mock shopping cart, which contains the mock values for the shopping cart items. We bring in the shopping cart service, the cart component, which is the subject under test, mock builder, mock renderer from the ngmocks, app module, and let's have the describe part which says the cart component. And before each, let's do the mock builder of we inject the subject under test and we mock everything using the app module. But since there is a service as the dependency injection, I say dot mock of shopping cart service, and we need to return a specific value from the shopping cart service. So we can have our object, the configuration object, and we need to say the get all cart items is a function that should return an array of shopping cart items. And for the test case, we say it should be defined. We bring in the fixture by calling mock render of cart component, which is the subject under test. And then we say expect fixture dot component instance to be defined, or to be precise, fixture dot point dot component instance to be defined. Switching back to the terminal, if we run yarn jest and the absolute path to the cart component, this should only run the cart component and the test case passes. We also need to check one more condition where the ng on init brings in the values from the get all cart items and populates the cart items property in the class. So let's write one more test case. It should populate the cart items, bring in the fixture, and from the fixture, let's get the component instance, and we call fixture dot detect changes. So the change detection has happened, which is essentially running the ng on init. And since we have already configured the shopping cart service dot get all cart items to return us a specific set of mock shopping cart values, we can expect components dot cart items dot length. So since the cart items is already populated and this is an array, we can do component dot cart items dot length to be 2. So if you take a look at the mock shopping cart, this as of now contains 2 items. So this essentially returns 2 items. So our expectation is that the cart items should also contain 2 items. So if we switch back and run the spec file in the terminal, the test case passes. Moving on to the next component to be tested, which is the contact component. And I believe this should be the simplest component to be tested in the application, because all we have is just one property here called details. And the HTML is also pretty simple. So let's add in the spec file contact.component.spec.ts. Let's bring in the imports. So importing the phone pipe, because in the HTML template, we are using the phone pipe to format the phone number. Let's bring in the contact component, which is the subject under test. Bring in the mock builder, mock render, and the ng mocks from the ng mocks package. App module. And let's describe the contact component, within which let's have our before each, which returns the mock builder of contact component, which is our subject under test, and we pass the app module as a catch-all and mock everything except the contact component. But since we are using the phone pipe, we also need to say, don't mock the phone pipe, but I need the phone pipe as is. So just keep the phone pipe without mocking it. We have our first test case. It should be defined, and within which we grab our fixture and we expect fixture dot point dot component instance to be defined. Switching back to the terminal, let's do yarn jest contact dot component, and the test case passes. There is one more test case that needs to be covered in the component, which is about expecting the right format for the phone number. So here we say it should test the pipe to format the phone number. We bring in the fixture and we call fixture.detect changes. And let's log one small thing, which is ngmocks.formathtml of fixture. And let's expect that the ngmocks.formathtml.fixture should contain the formatted phone number. If you notice in the template, what we have as a phone number is an unformatted phone number. But since we are using pipe, we expect that the UI already has a formatted phone number. So let's save this, jump back to the terminal and run the test case once more. The test case passes, and if you see the fixture, somewhere in between there is the formatted phone number available, since we have used the ngmocks.formathtml of the fixture. So this is the whole fixture, but it is formatted so that we get to see just the text of it. So in that formatted text, we have the office with the formatted phone number, and the test case passes as well. The next component to be tested is the home component, and the template is the simplest. I believe it's more simpler than the contact component which we have tested before. The HTML also has just two items, a header as well as the app products component. So this would be a walk in the park. home.component.spec.ts. Let's have the imports for the home component spec file, the products component, the home component, the subject under test, mock builder, mock render, and ngmocks from the ngmocks package, app module, and let's have the describe, which says the home component, within which let's have the before each that returns the mock builder, which accepts the subject under test, which is the home component, and then we say app module. So accept home component, please mock everything in the app module. We write our first test case saying it should be defined. We grab the fixture and we expect that the fixture dot point dot component instance is to be defined. So if we switch back to the terminal and do yarn just home dot component, the test case passes. Now we can have one more test case here. Since we saw that there is an app-products in the template, we can expect that this should be defined in the template. Let's write the test case. It should render the products component. We grab the fixture using the mock renderer, and we say ngmocks.find of products component. So ngmocks.find will go to the template and find the app-products component, which is the products component. And let's do fixture.detect changes so that it calls the change detection. And then we say expect product element to be defined. So if the logic is right, the product elements should be defined. And just to confirm that this is not a false positive, let's comment this code, the app-products code, and run the test case once again. This time, this should fail. And it failed because the ngmocks.find couldn't get the products component as expected. So let's put it back, save it, run the test case and confirm that the test case is working again, which it is. The next component to be tested is the product detail component. So in the class file, we have an observable of a product. We have two things which are dependency injected. One, the activated route, and two, the product service. And in the ng on init, we need to grab the params ID from the route, and based on that, we should call the get product by ID to fetch the right product. And in the HTML, there is nothing much except unwrapping the observable in the template. So let's add the product-detail dot component dot spec dot ts. Let's have the imports for the product detail component. Let's have the cold from Jasmine Marbles, mock product from our mocks, empty and off from RxJS, router testing module from Angular/router/testing because we do have an activated route, the product service because we are dependency injecting the product service, product detail component which is the subject under test, mock builder, mock render and ngmocks from the ngmocks package, activated route and router module from the Angular router because we are using activated route here and router module is required for the same. We import the app module and let's describe the home component within which let's have the before each that returns the mock builder which accepts the subject under test which is the product details component passing in the app module. And since we have a product service which is a dependency injection, I'm saying let's have a configuration object and the product service dot get product by ID. Now this needs to be mocked. So instead of the real product service dot get product by ID, what we need in return is an observable of the mock product. And we also called provide. This is for the service dependency injection. So we are providing the activated route, and instead of the activated route, we need to use a custom value called use value of snapshot, which is an object that contains the params, which again is an object which contains the ID. So this in turn is for this particular line. From the activated route, we need to drill down to the snapshot.params of ID to get the corresponding route ID. So this is what which is getting mocked here. So whenever we have the activated route, we need to have a return of an object with this particular signature. Let's write our test. The home component should be defined. Let's bring in the fixture by calling the mock render, passing the product detail component, and we say expect fixture dot point dot component instance to be defined. So if we switch back to the terminal, yarn just product hyphen detail, the spec file should pass. Moving to the next test case, we should test the this.product details so that it fetches the right product from the product service dot get product by ID. So let's switch back to the product details spec file. Let's write the test case. It should display the selected product details. So we know that the selected the route ID is returning ID 1. So, and we already have a mock product which is mocked to return a specific value for the get product ID. We grab the fixture by calling the mock render, passing the product detail component. And here I am setting the expectations up front. So I have a cold within which I am saying on frame 10, please emit A and please complete it on the same frame. And that A is the mock product. So whenever I subscribe, the value I am expecting is the mock product. Now I say expect fixture dot component instance dot product details. We know that the product details is an observable of product. So we can say this needs to be observable of the expected. So this is also an observable. This is also an observable. And all I am saying is both should be the same. So if we switch back, run the spec file, and it should pass. And if you want to write a small DOM test to confirm that elements are there in the DOM, we can do that as well. So let's say it should render the item in the DOM. Let's grab the fixture. Let's grab the image. So if you go to the HTML, once we have the product details, we'll be having the image and the card body. So all I am trying to say is if the product details is rendered properly, then we will be having an image item. So here I said ngmux.find of image. Now the image will be defined only if the product details are there and it is defined. If it is undefined, the element will not exist at all. So here I said, let's grab the image element and let's call the fixture.detect changes and expect that image element is to be defined. So if we run the spec file, it passes. Next, let's go ahead and test the pipes. So if you open the pipes, pipe would be one of the simplest as well. So there is no dependencies for the pipe. It's just a class with one method called transform. So let's bring in the spec file, phone.pipe.spec.ts. Bringing in the imports, let's import the phone pipe, which is the subject under test, mock builder, mock render, and ngmux from the ngmux package. Let's describe the phone pipe, within which let's have the before each that returns mock builder, which takes in the phone pipe, and we provide the phone pipe because this is a provider. This is a service, so we need to provide it. We write our first test case. It should be defined. We grab the fixture from the mock render passing the phone pipe. We expect that the fixture.component instance or fixture.point.component instance to be defined. Let's go back and run the test for the phone.pipe. Yarn just phone.pipe and the test case passes. Since this is a pipe, we need to test the transformation as well. So let's write one more test case. It should test the transform value. Let's have a fixture, and in the mock render, we just need to have a paragraph with a string, and let's pass in the phone pipe, because as far as the phone pipe is concerned, it doesn't matter if it is a paragraph or a template. All it needs is to check if the transformation is happening properly. So here we only have a hard-coded paragraph with a hard-coded string, and I am passing the phone pipe to it. Then I expect ngmux.format text of fixture to be the formatted value. So if the functionality of the phone is working fine, we should be able to see the formatted value in the fixture. So if we save it and if we jump back to the terminal and run the test case, it passes. Next in line to be tested is the services. We have two services, the product service as well as the shopping cart service. So let's start with the product service. So if we take a look at the product service, we have one dependency injection, which is the HTTP client module, and we have a get all product, get product by ID, add product to DB. All are observables and all are having the HTTP calls. So let's have the products.service.spec.ts. Let's bring in the imports for the product service, the app module, mock builder and ngmux, product service, which is the subject under test, HTTP client module, because we are having Ajax HTTP calls. We also import the HTTP testing module and HTTP testing controller from @Angular common HTTP testing. We also have the mock products and mock products from the mocks, empty from RxJS, and let's describe the product service. Here, let's start with the usual things. We have the before each, within which we return the mock builder, which accepts the product service, and we also pass the app module. But we also call the replace to make sure that the HTTP client module is replaced with HTTP client testing modules, because when we are testing, we don't want the real HTTP calls to go through, but that should be replaced with the testing equivalent. Let's start writing the test case for the actual API calls that fetches the values using an HTTP. So it should test get all products. So in the test case here, we need to test the get all products. So we need the product service as well as the HTTP client for that. Let me switch back to the product service. So since this involves a few steps, I will explain based on the arrange, act, assert steps. So let's start with the arrange steps. So in the arrange steps, we need access to the product service as well as the HTTP controller. So we grab the instance of the product service and assign it to a const called service. Similarly, we grab an instance of the HTTP testing controller and assign it to a const called HTTP mock. Now, I created a variable called actual. Going to step 2, which is the acting phase, we call service.getAllProducts.subscribe, and whenever the value comes back, that value is assigned to the variable here. Just because I called subscribe here, it doesn't mean it will get the value instantaneously. Only when the API responds, that is when the subscribe triggers and the value appears within the actual variable. Now, let's proceed with the test case. Here I am saying the HTTP mock.expect1, there should be an API call towards this endpoint. So I assign that towards the API request. Now I am saying API request.request.method should be get. So I am basically expecting there is a get request towards this particular endpoint. And we use API request.flush and we pass in a bunch of mock products as the response. Only when the API.flush is called, this subscribe is triggered and the value, whatever value we return from here, is made available within the value here and is getting assigned to the actual variable here. So this is where the actual return of the API response, and this triggers the subscribe. And once this line is done, the actual value will have whatever which is returned from here. Now, last but not the least, we need to call HTTP mock.verify to make sure that we don't have any outstanding API request in progress. Now, once all these steps are done, let's move to the assertion. Here we assert that the actual whatever value which is available in the variable is whatever we have flushed as the response from here, which is the mock products. So if the assumptions are correct, the test should pass. So yarn just products.service and the test case passes. Now that we have written the test case for the get all products, fortunately the get product ID as well as add product to DB are more or less exactly the similar. So this for us will be more or less like a revision. So let's write the test case for that. So we should say it should test get product by ID. We have our initial setups, the arrangement where we have the service as well as the HTTP mocks. We get them using the ngmocks.find instance of product service as well as ngmocks.find instance of HTTP testing controller, which is exactly the same step as we have here. Let's define a variable called actual. Let's go ahead and call the service.getProductById. This time we need to pass in a product ID, which we are hard coding as 1, and we subscribe whenever the value comes back, that is assigned to the actual variable. Now let's go ahead and do the HTTP mock.expect1, and this time the endpoint is fakestoreapi.com/products/1, which is the one which is passed from here. Now we expect that the request.request.method is equal to get. So still there should be a get request to this particular endpoint, and we flush a particular product as the response. Since we are getting product by ID, the response is not an array of products, but the response is just one single product corresponding to the ID which we have passed here. So we are flushing the mock product as a response, and the moment we flush the value, the subscribe triggers and the value is made available in the actual variable here. Let's call http mock.verify to make sure that there is no request in progress, and then let's have our expectation saying the actual should be equaling the mock product. So the steps are almost the same in both the test cases. So if we jump back to the terminal and run yarn just products service, both should pass. Let's write the last test case for the add product to DB method as well. So let's start by writing the test case. It should test add product to DB. Let's have our two setups for the service as well as the HTTP mock as we have done in this test. Let's also have the actual variable, and then let's do service.add product to DB, pass in a mock product and subscribe. Whenever the value comes back, the value is made available to the actual variable. We go ahead and do HTTP mock.expect1 of the desired endpoint, and then we do expect request.method to equal post. Since this is an add product to DB, if we check the service, this is a post method. So this is a post call. So we expect the request to be a post to this particular endpoint, and let's do request.flush of empty, because for this post request we are not returning anything. So we just request.flush of empty, which pushes an empty observable. And let's call the http.verify to make sure that there is no outstanding API request in progress. And once that is done, we expect the actual to equal empty, because we have flushed empty here. That empty would be received here, and we can expect that the actual should be equal to the empty. So if we go back to the terminal and run the test cases, all three passes. Moving to the next file on line, which is shopping cart service. So this is relatively smaller file. So these three are private. Usually we won't test private methods or properties, because that is internal to the service which can change its implementation. Usually we test the APIs which are exposed outside the service. So let's add in the shopping cart dot service dot spec dot ts. Let's have our imports for the shopping cart service, starting with the mock cart, which comes from our mocks file, shopping cart service, which is the subject under test, mock builder, ngmocks from the ngmocks, app module, code from just marbles, and let's describe the shopping cart service, within which we have our before each, which returns the mock builder of the subject under test, which is the shopping cart service, and passing the app module. Till this point, everything is fine. Let's proceed with writing the test case. So let's say it should add items to the cart and get the count. So just so that we know what we are writing, let's open the shopping cart service on the side. So what happens when we call add to cart? When we trigger add to cart, the cart count, which is a behavior subject of number, which has its initial value of 0, that will be incremented by 1, and the this.cartItems.next, we push the cart item into the subject, and this dot underscore cart items dot push of item. So whatever the private variable we have here, this variable will be holding the whatever value which we had pushed into it. So let's write const service equal to ngmocks.find instance of shopping cart service because we need an instance of the shopping cart service to call all these methods. We call service.add to cart and pass in the mock cart. So this is same as passing one item to the shopping cart. We clicked that button to add a particular item into the shopping cart. Now initially the number was 0, and once we add an item, that number changed from 0 to 1. That is what we expect using the marble test here. Here we say result observable equal to cold A and the value should be 1. And then we say service.get cart count. So once we have added the item, the cart count would be increased from 0 to 1. And since this is an observable, I am saying this should be equal to the observable of the result. So this should be essentially equal to 1. So if we jump back and run the test cases, the test case passes. In this case, we have tested the add to cart, which in turn tested the get cart count, so that we can have one more test which tests the get all cart items. So let's write the test case. It should get cart items to display. Let's grab an instance of the shopping cart service and assign it towards the service variable. We call service.add to cart and pass in the cart item. Now we expect that the service dot get all cart items to strict equal an array of the mock cart item. Initially the array was 0. We added a mock cart which is an object, and now we have one item, and that one item should be an array containing that single item. So if the logic is fine, let's jump back and run it once more. And the test case passes as well. Moving to the next file that needs to be tested. Let's move to the shared folder within which we have the footer. If you take a look at the class file, there is nothing, and in the template there is only a small copyright. So there is virtually nothing to test here. So let's do it quickly. Footer dot component dot spec dot ts. Let's start with the imports for the footer.component.spec. So import footer component, which is the subject under test. Let's also import mock builder and mock render from the ngmocks. Let's describe footer component, within which we have our before each that returns mock builder of footer component. Let's have our first test case. It should be defined. Let's bring in our fixture by calling mock render and passing the footer component into it. Once we have the fixture, we can do fixture.point.component instance to be defined. If we jump back to the terminal, let's do yarn just footer dot and the test case passed. Moving to the last component to be tested, which is the navbar. So let's take a peek at the class file. We only have an observable which is a count. We have one dependency injection for shopping cart service, and on the on init we get the cart service.get cart count call, and in the template we are displaying the count. So let's add in the navbar dot component dot spec dot ts. Let's bring in the imports for the navbar dot component dot spec. So bring in the app module, navbar component, mock builder, mock render, shopping cart service, which is the dependency, off from rxjs, cold from just marbles, and let's describe the navbar component. Let's start by having the before each, within which we return the mock builder. We pass in the subject under test and the app module But since we have a dependency, we also call mock of shopping cart service. And then I am saying if there is a call to the get cart count, I need that to be mocked with this particular value. So from within the component, if there is a call to shopping cart service dot get cart count, I need that to be mocked by returning an observable of 1. Let's write the test case. It should be defined, and let's bring in the fixture by calling mock render and passing the navbar component. And then we are saying fixture dot point dot component instance to be defined. So jumping back to the console, let's do yarn just navbar dot component, and the test case passes. Similarly, we need to have one more test case to cover this criteria where we have an observable of number, and on ng on init, the cart service get cart count would return an observable of the number that would be assigned to this count variable. Let's switch back to the spec file and start writing the test case. So it should get the count. We grab the fixture from the mock render by passing the navbar component. We grab the component instance by calling fixture.component instance. We set our expectation saying that it's a cold observable, and on frame 10, please trigger the value of 1 and be completed at the same frame. And now I am saying expect component dot count to be observable of this expected value. Since the shopping cart service is already wired up with the mock for the get cart count observable, whenever the shopping cart service dot get cart count is called here, what this responds with is the observable of 1 value. So essentially the count observable will be observable of 1. We can expect that our component dot count observable dot to be observable of this, because this will eventually turn out to be an observable of 1 as well. So if we jump back to the console, let's do yarn just navbar, the test case should pass. And the moment of truth where we test the overall test coverage for the whole application. So yarn just minus coverage. This will show us the coverage for the whole application. So we have 100% coverage over all the files, including the statements, branches, functions, and lines as I promised at the start. So that's it for the tutorial. I hope the lectures turned out to be useful in understanding the library and how it makes testing easy and painless. If you have any comments or suggestions, please let me know in the comment section below. See you all soon in another tutorial. Thank you and bye-bye.